So Michael's going to give a brief overview of partnering with manufacturers.
Great. Well, thank you, Z. Let me just quickly share my screen here. All right. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate this opportunity. This is a condensed version of a longer talk that I give. So if you have questions, I can point you to the longer version that's online, or you can obviously contact me at any point. So just to quickly go through my credentials so you guys understand the context. So as Z mentioned, I'm CEO and founder of a company called Duralabs. We offer software tools to help hardware companies manage their bill of materials and supply chain. Personally, I have well over 15 years of managing various hardware engineering teams, electrical, mechanical, firmware, manufacturing. I've built products in various different markets: telecom, clean tech, wearables, drones, IoT, all the fun stuff. For the last 10 years, I've been focusing specifically on manufacturing. I've lived in San Francisco and Hong Kong and now lovely LA. And pretty much throughout my career, I've gravitated to working with early stage and smaller teams. I just think they're a lot more fun. It's more kinetic, like what you give into the company, you can definitely immediately see the returns. So I've definitely been where all of you are today. So a lot of good experience to reference. So while my personal experience is predominantly in electrical and mechanical products, I have done some textiles, but this talk is more abstract and it applies to almost any industry. And in my opinion, they all have these same 7 basic steps, regardless if it's food, if it's apparel, textiles, hard goods, soft goods. All of them have raw materials, goods that you purchase from independent suppliers. Some of these raw goods are manipulated in some way. If it's food, maybe it's seasoned or cured. If it's fabric, maybe it's printed or dyed. Plastic is milled or injected. You get the idea. Some inspection process, followed by an assembly process, and then final QA, packaging, and then logistics. You somehow have to get your product to your customers, inventory it, and deal with the supply chain. So hopefully this relates to everybody here on the talk. So I just want to start quickly with a definition to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So what is a contract manufacturer? So basically a CM, contract manufacturer, is someone you hire to procure, assemble, and test your product. You're not doing the production yourself, you're hiring someone else. Very often, the contract manufacturer, they'll produce several products for several companies, often in a similar space. A common term for this is also called outsourcing. So why do we use a contract manufacturer? Well, so first off, we want to leverage the resources they have. They have hopefully decades, definitely much, much more experience than you, and access to resources much greater than you do, that you want to be able to leverage and build upon. They certainly have a much better purchasing power. That's kind of the reason why they're in business, is they've either negotiated better terms with suppliers, or they can aggregate orders across their customers to be able to achieve the higher price tiers that you just don't have the volumes to get those pricing. And clearly, it's a much easier resource to scale up and down as your own product's volume capacity changes. And another thing too is it reduces your own capital costs. You don't have to invest in a lot of the resources, the machining, the tools, the warehouse space, and labor costs as well. So most companies, when they're first starting out, they don't have consistent production. They're not producing a product every day of the year. And so when you're dealing with the ebbs and flows, it's nice to be able to leverage someone else's resource. You don't have to acquire those resources yourself. All right, so where do you begin? When you're ready to contact a contract manufacturer. So like anything, you want to be prepared. So here's the 3 main things that I recommend to everybody in order to be prepared. So do your homework. First thing to do is to estimate your volumes for at least the next 2 years. And some of it's conjecture, but you should, as a business owner, you should have these numbers anyway, because it should be built into your forecasting, probably in your pitch deck to investors. But come up with what are the volumes and at what frequency you're going to be producing your product for over the next 2 years. And I'll get into this in a moment why it's important. The other thing too is estimate what you'll be able to make to sell your sell your product at on the market, because that's going to give you the upper limit of what your costs are going to be, and you're going to use that information to evaluate quotes you get from the contract manufacturer. And then last is to finalize the actual requirements of your product, what's more formally called the PRD, the product requirements document. Because if you're still changing the design or the requirements or the look, the feel, the performance, it's really, really hard for a contract manufacturer to give you accurate pricing if you're changing things all the time. So once you have these 3 things ready, then you are ready to go out and start approaching contract manufacturers. So how do you find one? So like anything, referrals will have the much higher chance of success. If you're new to the industry and you haven't built up a network of peers who may know contract manufacturers, another, a nice resource to tap into is your suppliers. So the people that you buy your parts and materials from are very likely selling to other customers who have already found a contract manufacturer that are working with the same parts and materials that you are. And so that's a nice reference to tap into, those sales reps or those suppliers. Obviously, if you do have industry peers who are building products similar to yours in the same industry, you can ask them for references. If you're still tapped out or you don't have those connections, there are online resources available. Those are a little bit more in the cold call region, but at least it's something that is available. And so what do you look for in a contract manufacturer? Well, the first thing that I always recommend is to find a contract manufacturer that matches the production capacity with your forecasting. So contract manufacturers are categorized by what their capacity is to produce. And in electrical mechanical production houses, those are called tier 1 through 3. So many people are familiar with Foxconn, who makes Apple's products and Samsung's products. That's what's called a tier 1, because they're making millions of units a month. A tier 3 is at the lower capacity. And it has nothing to do with quality, tier 1 versus tier 3. It is only to do with production capacity. And the reason why you want to match that is because if you're still starting out and you're only making 1,000 pieces a quarter or a year, you don't want to hire a contract manufacturer that used to manufacturing 1 million pieces a month or year, because they have a much different process, equipment that you're just not a good match for, and vice versa is true as well. The other thing to look for is a contract manufacturer that already has experience with building products similar to yours. So this is kind of a catch-22, because you want a contract manufacturer who manufactures similar products like your competitors' products. However, you want to be careful because you also don't want them to be building your competitors' products in the same factory. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, but it is something to look for. The other thing that is very, very important, and what I encourage people when they're starting this process to just come up with it, just kind of get into this frame set of your contract manufacturer is like a marriage, right? You are picking a partner to spend a lot of time with for the next few years. You need to do your diligence to make sure you're compatible. Just like if you're going on a date, you're looking for a life partner, you're doing some type of evaluation. Are they a good match for me? Do we communicate well? Do we have similar interests? Is this someone I want to be spending a lot of time with? Because if your company is successful, you are going to be spending a lot of time with your manufacturer. So you want to make sure it's someone you trust and you're compatible with. Your product is your lifeline to revenue and success with your company. You don't want to just trust it with anybody. So definitely spend the time to do reasonable diligence. And the trust is also, it's a two-way factor, right? So you need to trust that they'll build your product correctly, but you present yourself as a risk to them as well. They need to trust that you're going to actually pay your bills and you're going to deliver and be responsive. So you have a responsibility to establish yourself as someone that they can trust as well. So once you've narrowed it down to a couple of candidate contract manufacturers, there's actual very simple and rote processes you can start with to actually start engaging with the contract manufacturers to evaluate them. So one thing I like to do is send what's called an RFQ package, a request for quote. And it doesn't have to be all, you know, anything proprietary. You can put together a representative bill of materials and assembly information on how to build your product and send it out to a couple of contract manufacturers, and then look at the response, look at the quotes they send back. And this is a great way to evaluate how serious they are and the quality that they offer. So when the quote comes back, things to look at are how complete is it? How much attention to detail did they spend? Is it comprehensive? Do they even understand what you're building? Can you tell that they really understand what your product is? You know, they might be offering some suggestions for making it better or for changing out parts to reduce costs. Kind of gauge how much interest and understanding they have in your product from the quote package they put together. And another key thing to do is also ask them, or see if they've offered it, is ways to reduce costs, either in the near term or even the long term. The other thing to do that I can't stress enough is to audit the factory before you make your final selection. You want to go to their facility. You want to meet face to face, not only to mitigate any trust concerns, but also just to start with that relationship process, right? Putting a face with a name. They want to meet you. They want to know how serious you are too. Going to the factory gives you some visibility into how your product will be made. So, you know, down the road, when you have some problem, you'll be able to have some relationship or some reference on who in the factory is actually responsible for that task. You know who to talk to, or how they're actually building your product. And so there are obviously tons of resources available here in LA. So hopefully it's just a short drive for you. If you do choose to go overseas, it's worth it to get on a plane and go to the facility before you actually engage with them and get into a contract. So what are your responsibilities during this process? So your product needs to be designed to be manufacturable. Often people with less experience building a product will do the initial prototype, and it may look good. Customers, your initial customers might like it, but because of how it's designed, it's very difficult to be manufactured, certainly at any volume. And so there's a process called DFM, Design for Manufacturability, which might have to be done from your initial prototype until you're ready to actually go into contract with your contract manufacturer, and they can help you with this process. The other thing that you're responsible for too is to minimize changes. So if your product is still immature or not ready for market, or you still have design changes you want to implement, or you still have things you want to research, you're probably not ready to go into any type of mass production. Contract manufacturers can excel when your design doesn't change, because it allows them to optimize their processes, optimize their costs, improve the efficiency, and improve the yield. If you're constantly making changes to your design, it's very hard on them to improve their process and really provide value for you. The other thing too, which I mentioned earlier about your forecasting, it's tempting to tell a contract manufacturer that you're going to be making millions of units a year when honestly you might only be making 1,000. And the reason being is, again, because factories are set up for different tier capacities. And if you're dishonest with that information, you're not going to get the service you need. You're not going to get the performance you need. And you actually might do more damage for the relationship. And this has happened, you can get kicked out of the factory. Or they'll start giving you these high bills to cover any lost costs from the factory. So it's tempting to inflate those numbers just to make yourself look bigger, but in the end, it's always worth being honest. And then be responsive. So issues will come up, I guarantee it. If the factory calls you at 2 o'clock in the morning, they say, hey, the line's down because of this problem, be responsive. Because if you're not, remember, these factories don't make money when their machines aren't running. And so if you don't respond in time, they're going to kick your products off the line and put someone else's on. And then you might have to wait a couple of weeks at best, but even months until there's another open spot on the assembly line. So make sure you're responsive. So the final checklist, at the end of the day, I can give you all these diligent things to do, but you really need to trust your gut, right? Like any relationship, someone might look good on paper, you know, what have you, or, you know, you're both compatible, same interests, but something just doesn't jive. So always, at the end of the day, trust your gut. Review the proposal, which I mentioned earlier, visit the facility, do the audit, assess the cultural match, and communication. So even if those other three things look good, if you have trouble communicating, they don't seem to be understanding what you're saying, or you don't understand what they're saying, those are high risks. If everything else is fine, but communication just isn't there, it's not worth the risk, because what could happen is they may not understand a change or may not understand your design, and you won't find out until thousands of units come off the assembly line and you realize it was a mistake and they all have to go into the garbage can. So I'm gonna quickly gloss over this. So when's the right time to engage with the CM? So certainly after you've completed those homework tasks that I mentioned earlier, but hopefully that's as soon as possible, because as soon as you start engaging with contract manufacturer, they can provide value. While they may not actually be building anything for you for a while, they can be reviewing your designs and making suggestions on how to improve it. And so the earlier you do that, obviously, the less impact it has on your product in terms of opportunity to make those changes. IP is a big topic that comes up. I don't want to get into that too much in this talk, just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to talk about it outside. So the takeaways, remember, it's a marriage. You are building a relationship with a contract manufacturer that can last for a long time. So spend the same amount of effort into picking a CM as you would a partner. Always be honest. It never works out in the end if you're deceitful. Be prepared and be humble. Recognize that your contract manufacturer knows a lot more than you. They have a lot more experience than you, and they can really provide much more value if you are receptive to their suggestions. And then at the end of the day, just trust your gut. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michael.